Thank you. I've got a couple of more questions. You all have been generous with your time, and we do appreciate it so much because we do want to get this legislation across the line and get something on the books and be able to hold WADA to account. And we know WADA and their allies are going to fight this. As I said earlier, they've refused to come to the committee. They have refused to provide an explanation. I'm certain part of that is they don't want to be under oath and have to admit what is done. But Dr. Gupta, you've been somebody who made the decision to withhold those funds, and that was an impactful decision. And I want you to talk for the record for just a minute about why it is so important that Congress pass this legislation, give the ONDCP the permanent authority to oversee these funds, and then why it was important to withhold those funds.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Congress passed the authority. The first Trump administration gave us the authority to withhold. We exercised that for the right reasons. I think it's really important in legislation to ensure that ONDCP has that oversight authority to work in conjunction closely with USADA as well as the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic committees to ensure that American athletes are getting a level playing field. And only once that is done is we pay our dues. Of course, WADA isn't a favor of conditional dues payment because the argument is, well, every country will do that, but not every country is paying $3.6 million, and that's matched by IOC, which is over $7 million. So it's a large amount. I do think we have to have both the ability to withhold funds, but also appropriate representation on the governing bodies of WADA so we can hold folks accountable as well as address the bureaucratic aspects. Sometimes, as we saw with this scandal, that often becomes the reason for delaying or deferring or deflecting really incompetence and malfeasance.
Thank you. Mr. Tigert, I want to ask you about, I think it's Yannick Sinner and that case. And of course, that had to do with the International Tennis Integrity Agency, and they determined that there was a positive test for a banned steroid. And then they decided that Sinner bore no fault or negligence for the positive test. And then WADA, about a month later, announced that it would appeal that decision. And so you've got the athlete and WADA entering into a resolution that resulted in a 3-month ban. But it seems that WADA approached that very differently from how they approached the Chinese swimmers case. And I don't know if you have insight into why you think they would have approached these cases so differently.
It's impossible based on what we've seen to give even speculation of why they were approached so differently and what was so distressing and why you hear some of the world's top tennis players so outspoken about the unfairness now that they perceive in tennis was because how WADA treated this Sinner case, where they appealed it, rattled the sabers that it should be a 1 to 2 year suspension, and then on the eve of the hearing cut a deal with a very rarely used provision, and in their explanation attempted to say there were 67 other cases where they treated it similarly. We've went out and tried to find those cases, and they're nowhere to be found. And so it raises once again this idea that WADA is unilaterally making decisions not in line with the transparency, the disclosure rules, which are absolutely mandatory. And I neglected to say it earlier, but make no mistake on the Chinese cases, even if there was contamination, Madam Chairwoman, they still had to announce those cases. They still had to disqualify those athletes. So there is no justifiable reason these basic rules of transparency, even if it was contamination, which of course we don't believe that it was, and Cartier decided it wasn't necessarily proven, they still had to disclose them.
I want to ask you about something in your testimony. You said China has paid an extra $1.8 million. That's much more than their required dues, and they've done that since 2018, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And in 22, the Chinese earmarked $500,000 specifically for investigations in intelligence. And WADA turned a blind eye to every bit of this and allowed the Chinese swimmers to go ahead and come in. So do you believe there was a quid pro quo?
It's impossible to answer. However, what is clear is the perceived, at best case for WADA, the perceived conflict of, on the one hand, accepting, in addition to what you just mentioned, they have a private sponsorship with Aetna, the biggest Chinese, it's the Nike of China that also sponsors the Chinese swim team and the Chinese Olympic team. So they're getting extra gifts from China on the one hand, including the $500,000 you mentioned for specifically for investigation effort. And then on the other hand, they don't apply the rules, even if you believed it was contamination to China, and don't even investigate the facts that came across their desk. So at a minimum, the perception of that is what's destroying the credibility in this system.
Well, indeed it has. And I want to thank each of you for being here today and for your testimony and for your patience as we were running back and forth to the Capitol for votes. I will remind all of our senators on this committee that they have until the close of business on June 24th to submit their questions for the record. And then you, as our witnesses, will have until July 8th to respond to each of those. This concludes our hearing today. The committee stands adjourned.